Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And we are just about to begin this 2031 to 2032 offseason. We've now been in Oakland for 8 years. Kind of a strange scenario as we've been trying to save and rebuild the Oakland A's franchise. I'd say we've definitely made some progress because over the last 3 years, we've made the playoffs twice. We've had our two best seasons in Oakland. We've actually made it to the ALCS twice, and we won an improbable World Series back in 2029. But in between those two seasons, we actually had the worst season of our run in Oakland, winning just 71 games a year ago. That being said, we did just get a 2-year extension at $800,000 a year, which will hopefully guarantee that our tenure in Oakland goes for at least a decade. Talked a lot in the last episode when we reviewed our roster about what our potential plans were for this upcoming season, and appreciate all of the thoughts from viewers that we've received in the comments section to that episode since then. A lot of good things for us to think about. But given that we did end up getting a $8 million bump in our budget to $158 million this year, which is the highest budget we've ever had in the game, even though it still is the lowest budget in all of baseball by $20 million behind the 29th place Pittsburgh Pirates at $178 million. I think I'm inclined to view this upcoming year as a win-now type season for the A's. And because of that, and because of the situation we're dealing with our players, I think it makes sense to largely run things back with the same team. The $8 million increase in the budget will give us an opportunity to largely bring back the players that have made the ALCS 2 of the last 3 years. And in addition to being a competitive team the last few years, as we talked about in our last episode, we've also got a lot of players who are likely in their final season with us in Oakland next year, which to me is another incentive to try to keep this team that has been pretty good in the playoffs together. Colt Keith, our best hitters in the final year of his contract this upcoming year. We've got several players at the end of their arbitration years in 2032, most notably our ace, Jackson Ferris, as well as our starting shortstop, Brian Rincon. Ferris, actually, with the fact that he ended up on the IL at the end of the year, looks like his service time may be such that he may actually have a second and final, and actually not a second, but a final arbitration eligible season in 2033, but his number for that year is close to $18 million right now, so still could be the end of his time with us this upcoming season. We've got a team option this year on our longtime catcher, Drake Baldwin. And then we also have several players who are in their final year of guaranteed contracts who will be heading to a point where they have team options for the 2033 season. Tyler Soderstrom, most prominent among them, but we can also say the same thing about Chase DeLauder and Mason Miller. So long story short, we can kind of keep this team together for another year. It's probably going to be a very different roster in 2033, but for 2032, given the success we've had on the field, the bump we got in our budget, and the way that our contracts just line up, I think I'm inclined to view this as the last dance, so to speak, for this crew of Oakland A's, and to try to go for it this year, even if it ends up meaning that we may need to lower our scouting and player development budgets a bit. Kevin McDowell and Alkshi kind of like this plan, and I think that's ultimately what we're going to try to do. Thinking about our pitching, which has definitely been our strength this past season and throughout the playthrough, James Miller Media and Alkshi both kind of laid out some plans to do as much as we possibly can to keep the pitching staff together. And given that we are likely playing for one more run with this crew at the playoffs in 2032, I think I'm going to pursue that plan. That means we've already made an offer to bring Jackson Ferris back for next year, as I noted, with the fact that he did end up on the IL for, well, obviously it had to be 2 weeks at the end of this season. You can see his arbitration number, a little over $11 million for next year. But as I noted earlier, actually that number's come down since the last time I looked at it. It's only about $16 million, but there is a second potential arbitration and final potential arbitration season for him left in 2033. So I've made an offer to already bring Ferris back. That's something that Alkshi is on board with. Why me 943? Not necessarily as high on that plan. But given that we're definitely going to be losing Shane Baz, who was our number 2 starter this year, I just think losing the number 1 and number 2 starters off of a team that we want to keep competitive is going to be a little too hard to replace in the trade market or free agency. So that's one thing that we've done as far as the pitching staff. Another thing that was brought up by both YME943 and Alkshi, and they actually were on the same page on this one, is potentially trading away Joe Rock, and that's something that I think we'll investigate. He's been an all-star each of the last 2 years. He's arbitration eligible, set to make about $5 million, which for what he is starting to seem a little bit high to me. I don't think it's impossible that we bring him back, but I think we're going to shop him and many other players over the next few weeks until we get to the arbitration hearings and ultimately the start of free agency. I've spent a lot of time offline over the last couple of real-life days kind of seeing what the free agent market might look like and then pursuing the trade block, and even more importantly than the trade block, just doing player searches for every type of position and every type of player that I think might be the missing formula for these A's. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of obvious moves to make out there. I've got a few guys that I'm scouting, and I certainly hope that over these next few weeks of game time, we'll make some progress with them. But I don't think there's necessarily the obvious 100% perfect fit to go for in either free agency or the trade market. Kind of agree with Alkshi that a big hitting outfielder is ultimately what we most need to come out of this offseason with. I just don't know that that player is going to be there in the free agent market. And even in the trade market, the younger guys who fit that profile are basically impossible to trade for. And even the veteran guys who are making $20, $25, $30 million a year for the next few years have pretty prohibitive price tags just based on their skill sets. And they also have pretty high price tags in the trade market. So it's something I'm going to keep investigating and trying to accomplish. But it may be somewhat slow going. Thinking about some of our worldwide scouting department's recommendations on some position players, just wanted to give you some updated thoughts. I have exercised the team option next year on Drake Baldwin. This was another recommendation from Alkshi, and I agree with it. For the money he's going to be making, team option $5.5 million for this upcoming season, and looking at the options that were potentially available in free agency, as well as guys that we might want to try to trade for, I felt his combination of outstanding defense with a bat that should be useful despite the fact that he's coming off of his worst season offensively in Oakland. That bringing Baldwin back, particularly with a team that's focused on pitching and defense, made sense. I am still uncertain about shortstop Brian Rincon. Several of you, YME943, Alkshy, James Miller Media, suggest that we move on from him. And I kind of outlined the reasons why I'd consider doing that in the past episode. He's fragile physically, but we've somehow gotten over 140 games from him in each of his 5 years in the majors. That's why I feel like with a price tag of close to $11 million next year, we might be rolling the dice one too many times if we bring him back. That being said, he is an outstanding defensive shortstop. Looking at his career fielding statistics at short, 44.3 zone rating and a 1.064 defensive efficiency over almost 4,000 innings in the field. He's excellent defensively. He's great in the clubhouse. And over the course of his career, he's been close to a league average offensive player, although he's coming off one of the worst years of his career. But he's still, over 162 games, has been a 4-WAR player. Given the extra money we have to spend compared to what I thought we might have to spend at the start of last episode, I'm still considering bringing him back just because there aren't any options that are realistic in the trade market that are as good as him defensively or even just close to as good as him defensively. But he also is a guy who still does have some trade value, so haven't made an offer to him yet. Going to continue thinking about and exploring options for him over these coming days and weeks of game time. Could be back with us, but he could also be an important part of a trade package. Thinking about trade packages, NS1 CLRK is recommended, potentially moving on from Tyler Soderstrom, especially with a young infielder, first base / DH type. Kevin Stubblefield signed and on the way. Soderstrom's contract is still very reasonable, and he does have some decent trade value, so that's something that I'm thinking about and considering. I do agree with NS1 that it's very conceivable that Soderstrom's ratings at his age are headed in the wrong direction. Hasn't necessarily shown up in how our scout looks at him yet, but it's very conceivable that it could happen in the not too distant future, as he's going to be turning 30 in less than 3 weeks. So still uncertain on what ends up happening with him. If he'll help us clinch a trade for a big-time outfielder or a big-time starting pitcher, I think I'd be willing to include him to get a deal across the finish line. But I think it's also conceivable that at that decent contract and with the fact that we need as much offense as we can possibly keep on this team, there's a chance that he ends up back with us next year as well. And the last kind of position player situation to talk about is something the notorious KEV brought up, and that has to do with Jake Ortega, who's now only listed as the number 20 prospect in baseball, but a guy that we've signed to a long-term contract at this point, despite just 58 major league at-bats. Don't know whether he makes the 26-man roster coming out of spring training next year. But I do agree with the notorious that given that there hasn't been a lot of progress in his development in AAA over the last couple of seasons, last season and a half to be more fair about it, it may be time to just put him in the lineup in the majors every day and hope that that jumpstarts his development at the age of 24. Can't really say jumpstarts his development, but maybe more accurately helps finish off those last vestiges of development that we still think are available to him. A lot depends on what we do this offseason. If we add a big hitting outfielder too, somehow through the trade or free agent markets, it's conceivable that Ortega might begin the season back in AAA, particularly if his ratings don't look much better than they look right now. But ultimately, he's going to need some playing time and some consistent playing time in the majors next year to hopefully help finish off that development or figure out once and for all that maybe we've been thinking his ceiling is higher than it actually is. So he'll certainly get it at some point next season. So that's kind of my latest thoughts on how to pursue the early stages of this offseason and the type of things that we're exploring, influenced, of course, by the feedback from all of those of you who have been generous enough to share your time and ideas with me. So since we're probably not going to be moving too far forward in this episode because I've got a lot of players to shop over the next few days, and we can only shop 5 a day and work on only so many contracts and different permutations of trades before I need updated scouting reports or I just run out of guys on our team and, more importantly, spots on our team to shop. Going to spend a little time giving my annual update on some of the top prospects around baseball that we've thought about acquiring in the past and have for various reasons not. Byron Dervish is a first baseman, part of the Houston organization that was part of the first IAFA class that we looked at. Made it to Double-A this past year where he did hit 21 homers, but he batted just $170 and was well below replacement level at the Double-A level at the age of 22 into 23, so the Stockport, England product still looks like he potentially has exceptional power, but doesn't really look like he's going to be a big-time player. In contrast, Galterio Mancina, another guy that we really liked in that first IAFA class, and we just decided to go in a different direction. Spent this last year between high A, AAA, and the majors. And he hit .295 with 12 doubles, 3 homers, and 166 at-bats, 115 WRC plus in his major league debut at the age of 23 in Kansas City. He certainly has a profile that indicates he could be one of the better hitters in baseball for hopefully for the Royals many years to come. Jesus de la Campa was an international free agent signing from a couple of years later. Made it up to Double-A ball at the age of 21. Honestly, he was 20 when it happened, right at the end of this season. And he was 4 for 16 there with a double after a really good offensive year in A-ball. So De La Campa, another guy in the Royals organization who still looks like he could be a pretty interesting hitter, albeit without a ton of power and ability to draw walks when all is said and done. David Orta is a guy that we really liked in the 2026 IAFA class. Made it up to Cincinnati right at the end of this past year, but he had just 3 hits in 60 at-bats. And looking at those batting ratings, you can see why he was tremendously overmatched at the major league level. Struck out 34 times in those 60 at-bats. Still an interesting glove, but at the age of 22, he's got a lot of work to still do to get that bat up to major league quality, although he still is considered the number 38 prospect in baseball. Greg Cuff, left fielder out of Ohio State. He's a guy that, did he go? Oh, he went unsigned a few years ago, and he'll be in the draft this upcoming year. Okay. I forgot it. 3 years, so he's still got 1 year left in college before he's going to potentially be available. I tend to think after the 85 wins we had this past season, we'll probably be picking too late in the first round this upcoming year to have another shot at Cuff. And last but not least, Daniel Campos, center fielder from the 2028 IAFA class, is viewed as the number 6 prospect in baseball. Not really sure at all what the Brewers organization has been doing with him. He's hit .333, .468, and .404 over the past 3 seasons, but they still have never promoted him out of rookie ball. Only 20 years old now, but with the way he's performed, if he was in my organization, I certainly would have moved him up. You can see he is an absolutely dominant player in the Dominican leagues this year, but even in Class A ball, it looks like he should be able to hold his own. So I would expect that we'll see him there next year, and they have, in theory, promoted him for next season up to the Carolina League. Turning to some of the top pitching prospects that we've considered in previous years, Jesus Escobar, a 17-year-old who was just a IAFA signing this past year, been out since August with ulnar nerve entrapment. He was 2-4 with a 5 ERA in rookie ball for the Pirates organization. Still looks like he could certainly be a solid major league pitcher if everything comes together, but no guarantees about that. Jeremy Martin, a guy that we considered as a college prospect out of Indiana a couple of years ago. Had a much better second season in the majors, 15-4 record. Started 17 games, but also had 17 saves and a sub-3 ERA over 133 innings. Put up a 2.5 WAR for the White Sox. So Steel Arm Johnny, who went 9th overall in 2028, definitely starting to live up to that lofty draft position this year. Chris Patterson is a guy that we've looked at in the draft a couple of times. Thought about him back in 2028 and then dreamed about him this year as he was coming out of college. Unfortunately for us, he went 1st overall, so we had no shot at him. Looks like he ended up getting signed late, so some negligence there by the Tampa organization. They've got Cowboy Patterson assigned to AAA, but they didn't actually end up getting to see what he could do on the field as a professional this past year. Certainly looks like he could be a very good major league pitcher. The other Mr. Patterson who was in this year's draft, Kevin Patterson, is a guy that we did think about with our first pick in the first round, which was, I believe, at number 10, somewhere in that range. He ended up going 12th overall. And he split the year between rookie ball and A ball. Not particularly effective at either level coming out of California, particularly in the very small sample size in A ball, where he had an ERA of almost 16 and 7 walks and 7 1/3 innings. But the introduction to professional ball is difficult for many, and still think Patterson can be a good pitcher. Connor Fister, who we thought about in 2029, had some shoulder inflammation that cost him the end of the AAA season, but he was 11-13 with a 4.83 ERA in AAA this year out of Georgia Tech. Looks like he could be a good, solid major league pitcher, and certainly if he fully develops, he could be a very good major league pitcher, but at almost 24 years old, he's kind of getting to the Ortega zone where just don't know how much of his alleged potential he's ultimately going to reach. Omari Rafael, a guy we thought about taking in the 2029 draft. He will be back in the draft this year coming out of Piedmont College. Still looks like he could be an outstanding pitching prospect. Has gone 10-2 each of the last couple years at D3 Piedmont. Weird place for a top major league prospect to be. You can see the competition level there is poor. So no surprise that he's been pretty dominant. Tend to think he probably won't be available when we'll be picking, but would certainly love it if he was. He went 26th overall a couple of years to go to the Rockies. So that's probably about where we'll be picking this year. Would love it if he was on the board, but certainly no guarantees. Andres Rojas, the knuckleballer, who is now a circle change and a pretty good curve, potentially, to go with that knuckleball. 14-8 record this year, and he led the National League in strikeouts, ERA, WHIP, strikeout to walk ratio, quality start percentage, FIP minus, and WAR. The now two-time All-Star, who's only 24, certainly looks like a very strong candidate to win perhaps his first Cy Young Award this year. We obviously had a shot at him in the first round of the 2027 draft. We went in a different direction. We were hoping that he would fall to us at number 53, but unfortunately, as we've talked about in the past, he ended up going 6 picks before that, so that's a big miss for us. Alan Walling out of Southern Indiana, a guy that we thought about a few years ago in the draft, 10-11 with a 3.67 ERA this year, so he also better in his second year in the majors than he was in his first. Looks like he can still be a pretty solid major leaguer. Juan Sanabria, an international free agent signing from back in that first IAFA period we played through in 2025, finally made his major league debut right at the end of this year. Was not particularly impressive, but it was 4 innings pitched over 3 games. Still think if he reaches the top end of his potential, he could be a pretty useful major leaguer. And then last, and honestly possibly least out of the players we're talking about, it's our former prospect, Cruz Schoolcraft, who we traded away before this season started. The Giants organization ended up stopping trying to make him a two-way player. They've turned him into a pure pitcher, and he split the year between Double-A and the majors in 33 major league innings. He pitched his way to a 6.27 ERA, more walks than strikeouts, and 5 home runs allowed. His control and his frequency in giving up home runs were things that we've talked about over the years that had us concerned about him. He was, when we picked him, the number 10 overall pick in the draft, so that's certainly a miss for us. But he's no longer our issue. Wish him the best with the San Francisco organization, but I think that lack of control is going to be a career-limiting issue for Mr. Schoolcraft. But even more interesting than the players we have passed upon over the years, and in some cases whiffed upon, are the guys who are part of our minor league organization, which is 9th ranked at this point in all of baseball. Was a bit higher ranked during the season, so it slipped a bit as things were re-racked with the start of the offseason. The good news is with that high first-round pick we had last year and the excess money that we had put aside, we'll be able to cut our draft budget likely pretty significantly this year, so that'll give us a little more money to play around with. But we do have 4 top 100 prospects, including 3 of the top 30. We've talked a little bit about Jake Ortega. He does not have much left to prove in AAA after putting up a 118 WRC plus this year. He will be part of our outfield as a regular at some point next season. I think the big question is just whether it's coming out of spring training or sometime later in the year after he gets a little more AAA seasoning. I think a lot will depend on if we're able to add a couple of, I don't even want to say big time, but if we're able to add some helpful outfielders this offseason, that lowers Ortega's chances of being on the roster in April. And a lot will also depend on what he's able to do in the development lab this offseason. And before we finish off this episode, we'll talk about what we're thinking in terms of the development lab for this offseason after we go through our prospects. Ortega certainly will be one of those guys in the dev lab, though. Arturo Estrada, international free agent signing from 2028, was not great in A-ball this year, but to be fair, he was a 19-year-old most of the season, and he still certainly held his own with a 91 WRC plus. Did have 20 home runs in 532 at-bats, but the batting average was just 222. Don't expect him to have that type of home run power when he ultimately gets to the majors, but still really like that combination of high contact, high gap power, and high speed if he fully develops, along with a really good personality. He's the number 29 prospect in baseball. The hope would certainly be that John Thomas can begin next year at high A in the Midwest League. Not quite ready on paper, but after 2 seasons in A-ball, it's probably just time to move him up, even though on paper he's not quite ready. And hopefully by the end of next year, he may be knocking on the door of getting to Double A, late in the year when he turns 21. So still a high-end potential prospect who's pretty young for a guy who's had 2 seasons in A-ball. Isn't developing perfectly, but still certainly has a chance. Arturo Uresti, who was our IAFA signing in 2030, had a really nice introduction to pro ball this year in the DSL. Hit .304 with 18 homers and a silly 82 runs batted in just 289 at-bats, 137 WRC plus, and a 2.6 WAR. At 18 years old, the power and the eye are even exceptional for the DSL. But when we think about promoting him to A-ball, he's definitely borderline. Given that he doesn't have much left to prove in rookie ball, probably will be inclined to promote him to A-ball next year, but it's conceivable that at his young age he may follow a path more similar to Estrada and end up spending a couple years or close to a couple years in A-ball. And our final top 100 prospect was our first-round pick from this past year, and it was 10th. Glad to know that my memory is not completely gone at this point. Shiloh Solis, the infielder, hit just a .179 in 134 at-bats after we drafted him. Was a below-average offensive player, but still a bit above replacement level for rookie ball. Would expect that he'll be back in rookie ball next year, but in a best-case scenario, maybe he'll be up in A-ball before this time next year. And we've also got 7 prospects ranked between 101 and 200, so not necessarily the prime prospects, but still guys that we hope, most of whom will ultimately become useful major leaguers. Jaheim Pennyman is still a guy that we like a lot. Started the year in high A-ball where he was 12-3 with a 4.28 ERA. Allowed 20 home runs, which has been an issue for him over the course of his career, but struck out 150 batters in those 117 and 2/3 innings. So we promoted him to Double A, and unfortunately he only pitched 2 games there before he suffered a torn flexor tendon in his elbow. He was 1-0 with a 2.89 ERA, and he struck out 16 in 9 1/3 innings in Double A. So he did a pretty solid job there in that small sample size. Still really like his personality. It looks like his high-end potential is not as high as we once thought it was, particularly for a guy that we picked 2nd overall. Still hopeful, though, that he develops into a good major league pitcher. Unfortunately, with that torn flexor tendon in his elbow, we're not going to be able to get him into the lab at the start of this offseason. Alejandro Landin, IAFA signing from 2027, split the year between rookie ball and A-ball, and he did a pretty solid job at both levels. 172 WRC plus in rookie ball, followed by a 122 in A-ball. He's 21 years old. Would hope that we could get him to high A next year, although at this point he's still looking borderline-ish for that, but he'll be turning 22 by next summer, so even if he doesn't start this year in high A ball. The goal would certainly be to get him there at some point next year. Bertrand Albrighton is an IAFA signing from 2026 who once was one of the top prospects in our organization. Still one of the better prospects in our organization, but his ceiling is no longer at the exceptional level that it once was. Pretty productive year, though, combined for 19 homers between A ball and high A ball. Well above average offensively, particularly in high A. Still think he could ultimately be a useful major league bat with some positional versatility, albeit he's not going to be very good anywhere in the infield except at first base. Brings a great personality, captain personality with a lot of positive personality traits to the clubhouse. He has been fragile since we picked him up. But if that contact and home run power can both ultimately develop to above average, he could be a guy who in the next 2 or 3 years, if we keep Soderstrom on board over that time period, could ultimately be the eventual replacement for Tyler Soderstrom in a first base / DH role. The hope is over the next decade that Stubblefield will certainly fill one of those roles for us, but it is possible a couple years down the line that maybe Albrighton will be paired with Stubblefield in one of those roles rather than Soderstrom. Josh Mangano, second-round pick from 2028, split the year between rookie ball and A ball, 3-2 with a 2.60 ERA in A ball. Don't know that he is quite ready to make it to Double A, but looking at his ratings, probably ready for a promotion to high A ball next year. Like his durability, like a lot of his personality traits, like that he throws in the mid to high 90s, like the ground ball tendencies. I don't think he's ever going to be a superstar. He's going to have to stop walking so many batters eventually, and he walked almost a batter every other inning, even in A ball with the good success he had there this year. But still a guy who could end up being an important part of our rotation in a few years. Joe Lewin, another guy who we picked in the first round in 2030 that we hope will be an important part of our rotation down the line, but he was 1-10 with a 6.15 ERA as an 18-year-old in his first full year of rookie ball this year. So his ceiling still indicates he could be a pretty useful major league pitcher, but he has a long way to go before he will be there. Luis Coronado, shortstop who we picked in the second round this year, hit .220 with 5 homers and 17 ribbies in 141 at-bats. If he fully develops, the glove and the batting ratings are a nice combination, but obviously at 19 years old with less than a season of professional experience, there's a long way to go to reach that ceiling. And the last top 200 prospect we have is Sergio Palomares. Just spent his second season in rookie ball this year. Started the year at 18 right at the beginning of the season, and he was 19 for most of that DSL season. And he hit .350 with 6 homers, 54 ribbies, a ridiculous 89 runs scored in 77 games. Another guy who not necessarily going to have a ton of home run power, but the combination of contact, gap power, and eye with his speed could be pretty useful down the line. And it looks like he's probably ready to move into A ball at the start of next year as a 19-year-old. We'll also mention, since we've been talking about him a bit, Kevin Stubblefield. He made it up into the majors for the playoffs this year after splitting the year between Double A and Triple A, and all he did was win the ALDS MVP. Tend to think with these batting ratings, he is almost certainly going to be on our 26-man roster next year. As I mentioned, kind of thinking about him and Soderstrom in the context of a first base and DH slot in our lineup. Probably will move Colt Keith back to third this upcoming season, which will likely be his final season with us. So we might be a little weaker defensively on the corners, but Colt Keith is still a more than competent third baseman, and the downgrade from Keith at first base to Soderstrom or Stubblefield at first base is not dramatic, and it'll allow us to hopefully get one more productive bat into the lineup. And I mentioned earlier I would check in on our development lab plans, and a little bit of a different approach this year. We normally try to go with programs that we think have a higher probability of success, and we're doing a little bit of that this year, but we've also got 6 younger guys in programs where we don't necessarily feel like there's a great probability of success for any of them. The hope is maybe we get lucky with 2+ of those programs and we can make some significant improvements in the offensive potential and current abilities of some of the top prospects in our organization. So the hopefully more likely to be successful programs are Jake Ortega on plate discipline. That's an easier program to execute on, and given that we think he could be in the majors next year, we hope and certainly expect him to be in the majors at some point next year unless he has some significant injuries. Getting him to hopefully make some progress with his eye so he can at least be drawing some walks will hopefully help him be more productive next year. Still could be a situation where if there's some untapped potential that we see a year from now, we put him on one of the more difficult programs. But since he's going to be playing for us in the majors next year, we want to ensure a high probability of success. Similarly with Jason DeCaro, we're going with secondary pitch improvement. Hopefully he can make some progress on probably either the fastball, the slider, or the curve, depending on which one of these is considered his best pitch and which one is considered secondary. But that could help his stuff a little bit. And then I mentioned the rest of it, we're going with lower probability of success programs, but we are trying to get some of these offensive prospects to move forward. Ken Weaver, the young catcher, who we think has got some decent home run power, we're going to focus on that. And then Stubblefield, Estrada, Albrighton, Rodas, and Shepard are all going to be working on quality of contact. If we're able to get out of this IAFA period with 4 successful programs, or not this IAFA period, this development lab period, with 4 out of 8 successful programs, I'd view that as a big win, because presumably that would mean that Ortega and DeCaro were successful, and then 2 of the 6 more challenging, lower probability of success programs were also effective. I think that's probably a bit wishful thinking, but we're going to give it the old college try and hopefully kickstart the development of some of these younger players in our organization over the next 3 to 4 months. And I mentioned that we've been spending a lot of time offline looking at some guys who might be able to help our team. Unfortunately, as far as realistic trade targets, I don't see anyone overwhelming right now. We've got another 5+ months of this offseason for that to change. But I think at least initially, with some of our arbitration-eligible players or some of the guys that we'd be happy to trade away and move off the 40-man roster, our targets are going to be a little less exciting, but much more realistic and still guys that I think could potentially help us. I'll talk about the 3 guys that we're kind of scouting right now, and certainly we'll be adding more to this list in the coming days. Catcher Max Kaufer is a right-handed hitting catcher who looks like he's going to be better against left-handed pitching than against right-handed pitching, so he could potentially fit really nicely with Baldwin this year. and then maybe become a candidate to be our starting catcher down the line. But a really good glove, a bat that I think could be at least respectable if it's playing mostly against left-handed pitching. He hasn't done much as a backup catcher the last 2 years in Detroit with a 71 WRC plus. But he has been an above-average offensive player, as I noted, against left-handed pitching. So I think for the role we envision for Kaufer, he could be a pretty nice complement to Baldwin, who would be playing against right-handed pitchers for this next year. Really like the defense. And again, if we can get that type of defense with a average or slightly above average bat by playing him primarily against left-handed pitching, that's something for us to think about. We've only got an average scouting accuracy on him, and as a backup catcher, I'm not expecting the price on him to increase dramatically over these next few weeks while we wait for that scouting report. So he's a guy that we're thinking about. Again, not a huge trade. I recognize not the earth-shattering, franchise-altering move that I'd love to make, and I'm sure some of you would love for me to make as well. But again, I'm looking at guys that we realistically have a chance at getting, and Kaufer is one that I'm thinking about. Jefferson Rojas is kind of similar as well, a 26-year-old second baseman, capable of playing multiple positions in the infield, right-handed hitter with a decent batting profile, another guy who looks better against lefties than righties, but could play him against right-handed pitching. He's been basically a league average offensive player over the first 3.5 years of his major league career. So I don't think he is a game changer by any stretch, but we could use another right-handed bat or two in the lineup that are effective. And I do like Rojas' defensive versatility, although he is certainly not an outstanding defensive infielder. I think he's respectable, and he's not going to really embarrass us, even though he's not going to make the same kind of plays and have the same kind of range as a Rincon or an Arakawa. And the last guy that we're scouting a bit more is an outfielder, and as opposed to Rojas and Kaufer, we've actually already got very high scouting accuracy on Mike Treen, another right-handed hitter who we think could be a pretty useful addition to our outfield. Very good defensively, very good speed. Former first-round draft choice. On paper, he looks like a pretty interesting guy to try to bring on board. I'd love a higher-end bat than Treen, but as I said, I'm trying to look at guys that we can realistically acquire and realistically afford. And unfortunately, here on November 6th, I think Treen is at the top of that list. The concern is that the price for Treen is pretty high. I think we can put a package together to bring him on board, but it's going to require some pretty good prospects and some pretty good major league players. So that's a little bit scary to me. But I do like the fact that he's another guy who could be in the mix for center field. The reason, though, despite him looking good on paper, that the potentially high price for Treen scares me even more is that he has been a brutal offensive player in his first two portions of 2 seasons in the majors, with a 194 batting average over 283 at-bats, just a 53 WRC plus, and he's been well below replacement level. And it's not like he's been doing this as a guy in his early 20s. He's been doing this as a 23 and a 24-year-old, and he's going to be 25 next year. So although I like him on paper, the price in terms of what we need to pay to bring him on board is real high, as I noted, and his actual production, particularly in the major leagues, has not been impressive at all. Not been impressive at all for a guy who's almost 25 years old. So that's part of the reason why, even though we think we've got very high scouting accuracy, I'd like to get an updated report before potentially pursuing him. The hope is that ultimately we can also, even if we bring on some combination of these guys through trade, still have the opportunity in trade or the free agent market to bring on a more obviously impactful bat than any of these guys. But unfortunately, there's no one that I would say we are close to doing that with at this point. And before we finish off the episode, we'll kind of circle back to some of the stuff that we talked about as we started things off. We have made offers to bring back Chase Burns and Jackson Ferris, a couple of guys who are getting expensive, especially for a team like the A's, but they were our first and third starters this year, and I don't think we can afford, with what the potential free agent market looks like, to move on from both of them in addition to Boz. Also made an offer to Caden Dana, who very well could end up rolling into a fifth starter type role for us next year, although he was in the bullpen this year. Infielders Diane Jorge, Hideki Arakawa, and Justin LeBron we've made offers to. I don't think there's a guarantee that all of them will ultimately be on the 26-man roster, but the prices are not overwhelming yet for what they are. And I think they're guys who can potentially mix and match into our middle infield, particularly Arakawa, and less so LeBron, with the likes of Soderstrom and Colt Keith having a couple of infield positions locked down. There's also some guys that we're less likely to bring back that I've kind of used my 5 opportunities to shop players on today, and that's Mason Black, Mason Montgomery, Pablo Aliendo, Nick Gonzalez, and Denzel Clark. The trade markets for them are not nothing, but generally not too interesting what we'd be able to get in return. I think it's conceivable that we may even end up making an arbitration offer to Mason Black, but need to see how these next couple weeks go. Maybe there's an opportunity to pick up a pitcher or two in the trade. And then we've also got to figure out what to do with some other players, notably Joe Rock is a guy we will probably end up shopping. Max Muncy is a guy who still has a little bit of trade value after we picked him back up this year. Don't think he'll be back. Nelvi Marte, who was in AAA for us most of this year and then did come up right at the end when we had some injury issues, is another guy that I don't think will be back with us next year, but might have a little bit of trade value for us over the next few weeks to help get a deal across the finish line. And then, of course, we've got the big decision on Brian Rincon, who's looking for pretty big money, but I just don't know if there's a shortstop with his defensive ability that we could realistically bring in to replace him. And given how dependent we've been on pitching and defense, and given that ultimately I think we're trying to win one more time with this team next year, it's conceivable that Rincon, even at that high price tag, with the potential for an injury with that fragility, could still be on our team next year. But those are the big kind of decisions we're going to be focused on over the next few weeks. We've also got some pending free agents in Gabriel Gonzalez, Chase Lee, Jordan Romano, Thomas Sajaci, and Alex Vesia. I think Vesia is probably the most likely one of them for us to bring back, but Lee can't be ruled out, and Gonzalez certainly has a chance. Sajasi, I think, is going to be too expensive for what he is, and Romano, I think it's probably just time to move on. And we've also got some big free agents, most notably Boz and the rental Royce Lewis, as well as the other rental Trevor McGill, who are hitting the market as well. We did make an offer to Hagen Smith, but he was not pleased with that offer and has cut off negotiations with us. So maybe we'll get another chance to engage with him before the beginning of free agency. If not, we will wish him luck in his next stop. He was, as we talked about an episode ago, brutal for us with a 5.57 ERA, 17 walks, and 4 home runs allowed in 21 innings. But when I look at his ratings, I still feel like he could be a pretty useful left-handed reliever who could start for us in a pinch. So I'm not totally averse to bringing him back, but it's got to be on terms that I consider reasonable, which apparently he considers an insult at this point. And with that, we're going to call it an episode. Thanks again for all of you who shared thoughts on what we should consider doing this offseason with us. We'll find out what type of progress we make on those fronts in our coming episodes. Probably are going to sim ahead a few days until our next episode, just to churn through our ability to shop people, hopefully get a couple of those scouting reports that we're looking for back, and maybe if everything goes well, make a trade between now and the next episode. I don't think it's going to be anything revolutionary, just based on the realistic opportunity set that I think is out there, but there's always the opportunity for me to get creative and or desperate, so you never know what we'll be reporting on the next time around. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.